How does a seminary student become history's greatest mass murderer? This question haunted me throughout my research for Stalin, and the answer reveals something profound about the nature of evil itself. We live in an age that refuses to believe in absolute moral categories, yet Joseph Stalin stands as irrefutable proof that some men choose darkness so completely that they reshape the world through sheer malevolence. The comfortable myth persists that Stalin was a pragmatic, if ruthless, leader who modernized Russia. Nothing could be further from the truth. Stalin was a psychopath whose paranoid cruelty killed more human beings than Hitler, yet somehow escaped the universal condemnation his crimes deserve. Why? Because too many Western intellectuals found his ideology seductive, preferring beautiful lies to ugly truths. Today, as authoritarianism rises again across the globe, we must understand how character corruption operates on a massive scale. Stalin's story isn't merely historical curiosity, it's a warning about what happens when a society abandons moral absolutes and places power above principle. The patterns he established echo in every modern tyranny, making his character study essential for understanding our contemporary dangers. Chapter 1: The Making of a Monster: How Seminary Failure Bred Revolutionary Hatred. Joseph Vissarionovich Djugashvili entered Tiflis Seminary in 1894 as a promising young Georgian seeking religious education. What emerged 5 years later was something entirely different, a man whose hatred for God, authority, and human dignity would eventually consume millions of lives. This transformation wasn't accidental, it was the deliberate choice of a character fundamentally corrupted by pride, resentment, and an insatiable hunger for power. The seminary records tell a revealing story. Young Stalin initially showed promise, excelling in his studies and demonstrating genuine intellectual ability. Yet beneath this surface success, darker tendencies were already emerging. Fellow students recalled his cruelty toward younger boys, his pathological lying, and his complete inability to accept criticism or correction. When confronted with his failures, Stalin never accepted responsibility. Instead, he blamed others, harbored grudges, and plotted revenge. His rejection of Christianity wasn't intellectual but deeply personal. Stalin couldn't tolerate the fundamental Christian insight that all human beings are fallible and in need of redemption. His pride demanded that he be seen as infallible, superior to ordinary moral constraints. When seminary authorities disciplined him for reading forbidden revolutionary literature, Stalin's response revealed his true character. Rather than accepting correction with humility, he embraced a worldview that promised to make him godlike. The revolutionary movement offered Stalin something Christianity never could, the promise that he could reshape human nature itself through sheer force of will. Marxism's materialism appealed to his fundamentally materialistic nature, while its promise of inevitable victory fed his grandiose self-image. Most dangerously, revolutionary ideology provided moral justification for any action taken in service of the cause. By 1899, when Stalin abandoned his religious studies, the transformation was complete. The young man who had once studied scripture was now convinced that human beings were mere raw material to be molded according to his vision. This wasn't philosophical evolution, it was character degradation of the most profound kind. Stalin had chosen to worship himself rather than God, and this choice would have consequences that reached across continents and decades. The seminary experience taught Stalin a crucial lesson that would define his entire career. Institutions dedicated to moral formation were his natural enemies. Throughout his reign, he would systematically destroy churches, schools, and families, anything that might nurture independent moral judgment in his subjects. He understood intuitively that tyranny requires the destruction of moral authority outside the state. Chapter 2: The Revolutionary's Apprenticeship: Violence as Character Formation. Stalin's entry into revolutionary politics revealed the next stage of his character corruption, the systematic cultivation of violence as a tool for both political advancement and personal gratification. Unlike Lenin, who viewed violence as a necessary evil, Stalin discovered he genuinely enjoyed inflicting suffering on others. This sadistic tendency, carefully hidden beneath a facade of ideological commitment, would eventually metastasize into state-sponsored terror on an unprecedented scale. His early revolutionary activities in Georgia demonstrate how Stalin used political causes to satisfy deeply personal psychological needs. The young revolutionary organized bank robberies, kidnappings, and assassinations with remarkable efficiency, but witnesses noted his peculiar satisfaction when operations involved maximum brutality. Where other revolutionaries showed reluctance or remorse about violence, Stalin displayed enthusiasm that disturbed even hardened criminals. The famous 1907 Tiflis bank robbery illustrates Stalin's emerging character perfectly. While the operation successfully funded Bolshevik activities, Stalin insisted on methods that maximized civilian casualties rather than simply securing the money. When comrades questioned his tactics, Stalin responded with the argument that would become his signature justification: the revolution demanded absolute commitment, and those who flinched from necessary violence were betraying the cause. This period also revealed Stalin's extraordinary talent for manipulation and deception. He cultivated multiple identities, betrayed former allies without hesitation, and demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to present himself as whatever others wanted to see. Fellow revolutionaries described him as unremarkable, a deliberately crafted persona that allowed him to operate beneath the notice of both police and political rivals. Stalin's prison experiences further hardened his character and taught him valuable lessons about power dynamics. Unlike intellectual revolutionaries who spent imprisonment reading and debating, Stalin studied his fellow prisoners like a scientist examining specimens. He learned how fear operated, how hope could be weaponized, and how even strong men could be broken through systematic psychological pressure. The most revealing aspect of Stalin's revolutionary apprenticeship was his complete absence of genuine ideological conviction. While comrades risked everything for socialist principles, Stalin viewed ideology as a useful tool for manipulating others. He memorized Marxist texts not to understand truth but to deploy arguments that would advance his position. This instrumental relationship with ideas would later enable him to reverse any policy without psychological discomfort. By 1917, Stalin had completed his transformation from failed seminarian to professional revolutionary. More importantly, he had discovered his true talent, the ability to accumulate and exercise power through a combination of strategic patience, tactical ruthlessness, and psychological manipulation. The revolution would provide him with the perfect laboratory for testing these skills on a national scale. Chapter 3: The Christian Foundation Stalin Destroyed. Why Faith Matters for Civilization. Understanding Stalin's evil requires grasping what he systematically destroyed: the Christian foundation that had sustained Russian civilization for 1,000 years. This wasn't merely political strategy but deeply personal warfare against the moral order that had once judged him wanting. Stalin's assault on Christianity reveals how the destruction of religious faith inevitably leads to the deification of the state and the degradation of human dignity. Russian Orthodoxy had provided the moral framework that made Russian civilization possible. The Church's emphasis on human dignity as created in God's image, the importance of moral absolutes, and the necessity of humility before divine authority stood in direct opposition to everything Stalin represented. He understood intuitively that his revolution could never succeed while Russians retained belief in transcendent moral authority that limited state power. The systematic destruction began immediately after the Bolsheviks consolidated power. Stalin didn't simply close churches. He orchestrated campaigns of deliberate sacrilege designed to break the spiritual backbone of the Russian people. Priests were tortured and murdered in ways calculated to maximum psychological impact. Sacred objects were profaned publicly to demonstrate the powerlessness of God before the new socialist order. The persecution of Christianity under Stalin reveals the profound connection between religious faith and human freedom. When people believe in divine authority that transcends earthly power, they possess an inner sanctuary that no tyrant can reach. Stalin recognized this spiritual independence as his greatest threat, more dangerous than any military opposition. A believer who fears God more than the state can never be completely controlled. Stalin's campaign against the family structure further demonstrates his understanding of Christianity's social implications. The Church's teaching that marriage and parenthood reflect divine love created bonds of loyalty that competed with absolute devotion to the state. By destroying family stability and turning children against parents, Stalin eliminated the primary context where Christian values were transmitted from generation to generation. The replacement of Christian education with Marxist indoctrination wasn't simply changing curriculum, it was replacing transcendent truth with ideological manipulation. Christian education formed character by encouraging humility, self-examination, and recognition of moral obligations beyond self-interest. Stalin's educational system deliberately cultivated pride, resentment, and absolute loyalty to the party rather than truth or conscience. Most tragically, Stalin's success in destroying Christian influence created a spiritual vacuum that made the Russian people vulnerable to his own pseudo-religious claims. Having lost faith in God, millions transferred their religious impulses to the state and its supreme leader. Stalin didn't eliminate religion, he corrupted it, making himself the object of worship that belongs only to God. The famine in Ukraine demonstrates how the absence of Christian restraint enables unlimited cruelty. The Orthodox emphasis on caring for the poor and hungry would have made deliberate starvation morally impossible for Christian leaders. Stalin's atheistic materialism, however, reduced human beings to statistics that could be manipulated without moral constraint. Chapter 4: The Intellectual's Betrayal: How Western Thinkers Enabled Stalin's Terror. Perhaps no aspect of the Stalin era more perfectly illustrates the moral bankruptcy of modern intellectualism than the enthusiasm with which Western thinkers embraced and defended his regime. This betrayal reveals how intellectual pride can corrupt moral judgment so completely that highly educated individuals become apologists for evil. The pattern established by Stalin's Western admirers continues to shape intellectual discourse today, making their story urgently relevant for our times. George Bernard Shaw's visit to the Soviet Union in 1931 exemplifies this intellectual corruption perfectly. While millions starved in Ukraine, Shaw proclaimed Stalin's agricultural policies a magnificent success. When presented with evidence of mass starvation, Shaw dismissed it as capitalist propaganda, preferring his ideological preconceptions to observable reality. This wasn't ignorance, it was willful blindness driven by intellectual vanity and political commitment. The most revealing aspect of these intellectual betrayals was their selective application of moral standards. Critics who would condemn minor injustices in democratic societies displayed infinite tolerance for massive crimes when committed by socialist regimes. This moral relativism wasn't accidental but reflected a fundamental corruption of intellectual purpose. These thinkers had ceased seeking truth and instead used their intelligence to rationalize predetermined conclusions. H. G. Wells's interviews with Stalin demonstrate how intellectual sophistication can become a tool for self-deception. Wells, one of the 20th century's most celebrated minds, emerged from conversations with Stalin convinced he had met a fellow intellectual committed to human progress. Wells's reports completely ignored the terror apparatus operating throughout Soviet society, focusing instead on Stalin's supposed vision for technological advancement and social planning. The Webb's Soviet Communism, A New Civilization, represents the pinnacle of intellectual dishonesty in service of ideological commitment. Beatrice and Sidney Webb, respected social scientists, produced a massive study that portrayed Stalin's tyranny as the emergence of a superior form of democracy. Their methodology involved accepting Soviet propaganda at face value while dismissing contrary evidence as unreliable. This wasn't scholarship but propaganda masquerading as academic research. Walter Duranty's journalism for the New York Times reveals how intellectual corruption spreads through prestigious institutions. Duranty knew perfectly well that millions were dying in Ukraine, yet he filed reports denying the famine's existence and praising Stalin's agricultural policies. His Pulitzer Prize for this coverage demonstrates how intellectual establishments can reward the most egregious professional failures when they serve approved political narratives. The tragedy of these intellectual betrayals extends beyond their immediate political consequences. These thinkers possessed the cultural authority that should have been used to defend truth and human dignity. Instead, they used their influence to provide moral cover for history's most successful mass murderer. Their legacy illustrates why intellectual gifts without moral grounding become instruments of destruction rather than enlightenment. The pattern established by Stalin's intellectual apologists continues today in academic and media responses to contemporary authoritarian regimes. The same combination of ideological commitment, moral relativism, and selective skepticism that blinded Shaw and Wells to Stalin's crimes operates whenever intellectuals encounter regimes that promise to implement their preferred political theories. Chapter 5: Historical Patterns of Tyranny. Lessons Stalin's reign offers for today. Stalin's methods of acquiring and maintaining power follow patterns that recur throughout history whenever societies abandon traditional moral constraints. Understanding these patterns provides essential wisdom for recognizing and resisting similar threats in our own time. The techniques Stalin perfected have been adapted by every successful modern dictator, making his career study essential for defending democratic institutions and human freedom. The gradual consolidation of power represents Stalin's most instructive innovation. Rather than seizing control through dramatic coups, Stalin accumulated authority incrementally, always maintaining the appearance of collective leadership while systematically eliminating rivals. This patient approach to tyranny proves far more effective than dramatic power grabs because it allows opponents to rationalize each individual step as acceptable while missing the cumulative transformation taking place. Stalin's manipulation of crisis demonstrates how emergencies become opportunities for expanding state power beyond constitutional limits. Whether dealing with genuine threats or manufactured crises, Stalin consistently responded by demanding extraordinary powers that were never returned once the immediate danger passed. This pattern reveals why vigilance during crises is essential. Temporary measures have a remarkable tendency to become permanent when the public becomes accustomed to expanded government authority. The systematic destruction of intermediate institutions between individual citizens and the state represents another crucial pattern. Stalin understood that churches, independent media, professional associations, and strong family structures all provide alternative sources of authority that compete with absolute state control. By weakening or destroying these mediating institutions, he left individuals isolated and vulnerable to government manipulation. Stalin's use of economic dependency to enforce political compliance offers particularly relevant lessons for contemporary societies. By making employment, housing, and basic necessities dependent on political loyalty, he created a system where dissent became literally unaffordable for most citizens. This technique proves far more effective than physical terror alone because it turns survival instincts into tools for enforcing conformity. The cultivation of informants within every social group demonstrates how tyranny corrupts human relationships at the most fundamental level. Stalin's system turned neighbors against neighbors, colleagues against colleagues, and even family members against each other. This destruction of social trust creates the atomized society that totalitarian regimes require, where isolated individuals depend entirely on the state for security and meaning. Stalin's manipulation of language and history reveals how controlling information shapes reality itself for most citizens. By rewriting textbooks, controlling media, and punishing unauthorized speech, he created alternative reality where his failures became successes and his crimes became virtues. This pattern shows why protecting free speech and independent journalism is essential for maintaining any society's connection to truth. The international dimension of Stalin's influence demonstrates how domestic tyranny inevitably threatens global stability. Stalin's support for communist movements worldwide, his subversion of democratic institutions in other countries, and his willingness to use international tensions to justify domestic repression illustrate why isolating authoritarian regimes is essential for protecting democratic societies. Perhaps most importantly, Stalin's career demonstrates that tyranny succeeds only when good people remain passive. His consolidation of power required the acquiescence of millions who knew better but chose safety over resistance. This pattern reveals that defending freedom requires active courage from ordinary citizens, not just heroic resistance from exceptional individuals. Chapter 6: Providence and the Fall of Tyranny: How Divine Justice Operates in History. While Stalin's crimes seem to demonstrate the absence of divine justice in human affairs, a deeper examination reveals how providence operates through historical patterns that ultimately vindicate moral order. Understanding this dimension of Stalin's story requires recognizing that divine justice operates on timescales and through mechanisms that transcend immediate human experience, yet produce consequences that reveal the fundamental moral structure of reality. Stalin's paranoia, which intensified throughout his reign despite his apparent success, demonstrates how tyranny becomes its own punishment. The very methods that secured his power, systematic deception, betrayal of allies, and elimination of potential rivals, created a psychological prison where trust became impossible and genuine human relationships could never develop. By his final years, Stalin lived in complete isolation, surrounded by subordinates who feared him too much to provide honest counsel or genuine companionship. The systematic corruption of Soviet institutions under Stalin's rule illustrates how moral decay ultimately undermines even the most powerful regimes. When every official prioritizes personal survival over competent administration, when truth becomes subordinate to political expediency, and when fear replaces genuine cooperation, the entire system becomes incapable of responding effectively to challenges. This institutional decay would eventually contribute to the Soviet Union's collapse, demonstrating how corruption contains the seeds of its own destruction. Stalin's inability to create lasting succession reveals how tyranny fails to solve the fundamental problems of political order. Despite decades of absolute power, he proved unable to establish institutions capable of maintaining stability after his death. His paranoid elimination of potential successors, combined with his refusal to establish predictable procedures for leadership transition, ensured that his death would precipitate the exact kind of chaos and instability that he had spent his career trying to prevent. The gradual revelation of Stalin's crimes to the Soviet people demonstrates how truth possesses an inherent power that eventually overcomes even the most sophisticated propaganda systems. Khrushchev's secret speech in 1956 began a process of disclosure that, once begun, proved impossible to stop completely. The human need for truth about fundamental moral questions creates pressure that no political system can permanently contain, suggesting that divine justice operates through humanity's deepest spiritual requirements. The international isolation that eventually surrounded the Soviet system reflects how sustained injustice alienates even potential allies. Stalin's methods created suspicion and fear that extended beyond his immediate victims to include foreign governments and populations who might otherwise have been sympathetic to Soviet goals. This pattern demonstrates how moral corruption undermines the trust and cooperation that sustained political achievement requires. The spiritual desolation of Soviet society under Stalin reveals how the rejection of divine authority creates conditions that make human flourishing impossible. Despite material progress in certain areas, Soviet society never developed the cultural vitality, innovative creativity, or genuine social solidarity that characterize healthy civilizations. The systematic suppression of religious faith left a spiritual vacuum that no amount of ideological indoctrination could fill. Stalin's legacy within Russia itself demonstrates how historical truth eventually triumphs over political manipulation. Despite decades of official glorification, Stalin remains a controversial figure whose crimes cannot be permanently hidden or rationalized. Each generation of Russians must confront anew the moral questions his reign raises, suggesting that providence ensures the persistence of moral conscience across even the darkest periods of historical experience. Most profoundly, the ultimate failure of Stalin's attempt to create the new Soviet man reveals the limits of human power when directed against divine order. Despite unlimited resources and decades of effort, Stalin could not fundamentally alter human nature or eliminate the spiritual requirements that connect individuals to transcendent purpose. This failure points toward the operation of divine justice through the very structure of reality itself. Chapter 7: Lessons for America: Recognizing and Resisting Authoritarian Temptations. Stalin's career offers sobering lessons for Americans who assume that democratic institutions automatically protect against tyrannical rule. The patterns that enabled Stalin's rise operate in all political systems, including our own, making vigilance and active resistance essential for preserving the constitutional republic our founders established. Understanding how tyranny emerges incrementally provides crucial wisdom for recognizing and defeating authoritarian temptations before they metastasize into existential threats. The most dangerous parallel between Stalin's rise and contemporary American trends lies in the systematic undermining of institutional norms that protect individual liberty. Stalin's consolidation of power required breaking traditional constraints on executive authority, silencing independent voices, and weaponizing government agencies against political opponents. When American politicians normalize these behaviors, regardless of party affiliation, they create precedents that future authoritarians can exploit far more effectively than their predecessors. Stalin's manipulation of crisis to expand government power offers particularly relevant warnings for American citizens. Emergency powers that bypass constitutional procedures, expanded surveillance authorities justified by security threats, and restrictions on speech and assembly imposed during temporary crises all follow patterns Stalin perfected. The crucial lesson is that constitutional protections mean nothing if citizens willingly surrender them during moments of fear or uncertainty. The role of educational institutions in Stalin's success provides urgent guidance for American parents and civic leaders. Stalin understood that controlling what children learn determines what kind of citizens they become. When American schools prioritize ideological conformity over critical thinking, when they present political perspectives as established facts rather than debatable positions, and when they discourage students from questioning authority figures, they replicate the educational methods that made Stalin's success possible. Stalin's relationship with intellectuals and media demonstrates how cultural influence can become more powerful than direct political control. The enthusiastic support Stalin received from Western academics, journalists, and entertainers legitimized his regime more effectively than any propaganda campaign. Americans must recognize that tyranny succeeds when cultural elites use their influence to suppress uncomfortable truths and promote political narratives that serve authoritarian goals. The economic dimensions of Stalin's control provide essential warnings about the relationship between government dependency and political freedom. As more Americans depend on government for employment, healthcare, education, and basic necessities, the temptation for politicians to use these dependencies to enforce political compliance increases dramatically. Stalin's career demonstrates that economic freedom and political liberty cannot be permanently separated. Stalin's systematic destruction of mediating institutions between individuals and the state offers crucial guidance for strengthening American civil society. churches, families, voluntary associations, and local communities all provide alternative sources of meaning and authority that protect citizens from government overreach. When these institutions weaken, whether through deliberate attack or cultural neglect, individuals become vulnerable to the isolation and manipulation that make tyranny possible. The international implications of Stalin's reign remind Americans that domestic tyranny inevitably threatens global stability. A United States that abandons constitutional government and embraces authoritarian methods cannot serve as a beacon of freedom for oppressed peoples worldwide. Stalin's success in expanding communist influence demonstrates how strong authoritarian regimes inspire and support similar movements in other countries. Most importantly, Stalin's career illustrates that tyranny succeeds only when good people choose passivity over resistance. The Americans who built and preserved constitutional government understood that freedom requires constant vigilance and active participation from informed citizens. Stalin's victims often possessed individual courage but lacked the collective organization and sustained commitment necessary to resist systematic oppression. The ultimate lesson of Stalin's reign is that preventing tyranny requires more than institutional safeguards. It demands citizens of character who value truth over comfort, principle over expediency, and freedom over security. Stalin succeeded because too many people chose collaboration over resistance when the costs of opposition seemed too high. Americans must resolve to make different choices while those choices remain available. Conclusion. Stalin's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and political power that our comfortable age prefers to ignore. This wasn't a man shaped by circumstances beyond his control but an individual who deliberately chose evil at every crucial moment. His career demonstrates that tyranny emerges not through dramatic coups but through the gradual erosion of moral standards and institutional restraints that free societies require. Most soberly, Stalin's success reveals how easily civilized people can become complicit in enormous evil when the costs of resistance seem too high. Yet his story also confirms the ultimate triumph of truth over lies, justice over oppression, and human dignity over political manipulation. The Soviet system he built with such ruthless efficiency ultimately collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions, while the values he tried to destroy, faith, family, and freedom, continue to inspire new generations of people seeking authentic human flourishing. For Americans living in an age of renewed authoritarianism worldwide, Stalin's legacy offers both warning and hope. Warning that democratic institutions provide no automatic protection against tyrannical rule, and that preserving freedom requires constant vigilance from citizens of character. Hope that moral order ultimately prevails, that truth possesses inherent power that no propaganda can permanently suppress, and that individuals of courage can change the course of history. The choice Stalin faced in that Georgian seminary, between submission to divine authority and worship of his own will, remains the fundamental choice every generation confronts. History demonstrates repeatedly that societies prosper when they choose humility before transcendent truth, and decline when they embrace the pride that makes tyranny possible. Stalin's character teaches us that the fate of civilization depends not on impersonal forces but on the moral choices ordinary people make in extraordinary times.